Okay, looking sharp. Looking sharp today. Me and my Magnum PI shirt. Now, fiddle with a microphone. Now, constructing national identity is actually not that different from constructing personal identity, because the structures that are being applied and the methods that are being used in order to construct an identity are basically the same. So even in constructing national identity, we find things like stereotyping, things like othering, as well as the ideal image that nations in this case have of themselves, as well as the sort of demonized and homogeneous idea of the other. Now, of course, the term national identity has two parts. While we have extensively talked about the idea of identity, we haven't really spoken about nation as such or nationality as such. Now, the term nation is actually not only one of the most frequently used terms that we find, but also one that is the most contested in, for instance, political science, sociology, history, and other disciplines. And despite its frequent usage, it's not quite easy to define what a nation actually is, because the last century saw a plethora of developments in the concept of a nation. Further, the term has frequently been used interchangeably with notions such as nationality, nationhood, people, the people, or even nationalism. And in 1963, Lewis Wirth argued that a nation is a people who, because of the belief in their common descent and their mission in the world by virtue of their common cultural heritage and historical career, aspire to sovereignty over a territory or seek to maintain or enlarge their political or cultural influence in the face of opposition. There are a number of possible definitions of nations, such as functional definitions, constructivist definitions, definitions that follow genealogy, and rationalist definitions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these definitions and through each of these different conceptions of the nation in the following. So the first one is a functional approach to defining nation and nationhood. And a functional perspective stresses that nations have not developed by accident. Rather, they are optimal, or at least close to optimal structures or units that fulfill given functions in a better way than, for instance, their alternatives, which makes nations functionally indispensable in the context of modern statehood. Nation is associated with the development of a homogeneous language, facilitating communication and therefore enabling national sentiments to be constructed and preserved. This sort of unity and equality between members of the national community is viewed as a functional requirement for the cognitive and material growth of modern capitalist societies. Ernst Gellner argues that states can establish national identities through various means, for instance by the standardization of an educational system. However, he also says that the standardization of language is one component of this process, while the production of a mythologized historiography is another. This allows for a communicative centralization and standardization of modern society despite its cultural variety and complexity, which in turn is necessary for the efficient allocation of human resources in the process of the production and the allocation of goods. The nation is therefore regarded as a unique form of social consciousness that is historically anchored and therefore not easily replaced. The collective bond of nations is supposed to deepen the commitments and obligations between the members, or between those who share it, by providing an essential motivation behind civic commitments, namely the establishment as well as the upkeep of this nation and of nationhood. According to David Miller, nations are ethical communities. They are contour lines in the ethical landscape. The duties we owe to our fellow nationals are different from and more extensive than the duties we owe to human beings as such. In contrast, constructivist approaches to the nation put more emphasis on the socially constructed nature of nations, where historical contingencies play an important role. In this sense, nations have developed from a contingent consequence of unique events, such as the invention of the printing press, for instance. And Benedict Anderson focuses very much on this development of the printing press and of modern technology in his analysis of nationalism, where he traces its origins, that is, the origins of nationalism, back to the spread of print capitalism, which made the modern nation state possible by generating an imagined community. A nation, Anderson argues, is an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. It is imagined because the members of even the smallest nations will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear them, yet in the minds of each lives an image of their community. In this perspective, nations are represented in the minds of nationalized subjects and become influential frames of reference with serious and even destructive consequences. Thus, nations are specific forms of social identities that are produced and reproduced by means of language and other semiotic systems. The genealogical perspective is in turn in search of the route that nations have taken in their development over the centuries. For instance, Anthony D. Smith, in his ethnosymbolic approach to nations, argues that almost every nation has developed from an ethnic core. Smith argues that any attempt to explain how nations emerged, and I quote, must start from ethnicity, which is the most common origin of nation-states. There are three main arguments that pertain to this perspective. First, that the majority of today's nations were formed on the basis of pre-modern ethnic cores. Therefore, being powerful and culturally influential, they provided models for subsequent cases of the formation of nations in many parts of the globe. Secondly, that the ethnic model of the nation has become very much popular, as it sets so easily on the pre-modern demotic kind of community that has survived into the modern era. Third, that ethnic unity is a necessary condition for national survival, since it is hard for a political community to survive without a coherent mythology, symbolism of history, and shared culture. In order to survive, nations must be able to use the raw material of ethnicity, whose prominent element is the myth of the common descent. Therefore, nations with no ethnic core or shadowy ethnic ties are forced to fabricate the myths and forge the symbolism of a community of descent. As Greg Calhoun argues, where it is recognized that a nation has a founding moment, it is still attractive to see this as a consequence not merely of choice, but of a long narrative of historical development that historically locates the proto-nation in primordial times. From these three major arguments of Smith, we can derive four attributes of modern nations, which Anthony D. Smith again has formulated. He says that A, there is a strong emphasis on genealogy, on the fictitious ties of ethnic descent defining membership of the community. B, the importance of vernacular cultures, including myths of election, linguistic codes, customs, traditions, etc., etc. C, a nativist interpretation of history or ethno-history, the set of authentic tales, so to speak, retold by the community over and over again. And D, a commitment to the people, and hence an emphasis on the popular mobilization as the key to authenticity. Finally, there is the rational approach to nation, which refers to writings applying the rational choice model to ethnic and national collective behavior. Rational choice theory is based on the assumption that human beings are rational and are motivated by self-interest in their actions, be it in everyday actions or in political actions. In this perspective, individuals tend to behave as rational, cost-sensitive actors, as their actions are predominantly intentional and have a stable and relatively consistent set of preferences. Against this backdrop, most rational choice theorists consider national or ethnic phenomenon as similar to class, religion, gender, and status. Nations and ethnic groups are only different in that the individuals use the cultural and legal differences of the nations to demarcate themselves from other collectives with the single aim of maximizing individual advantages. There is a sort of fifth definition of nation that I would like to provide, and that rests on the theories and the conceptualizations of Krishan Kumar, whose definition of nation and nationhood follows similar lines to the definitions I've given above. His major differentiation of nations is the difference between state nations or Staatsvölker, that is political nations, and nation states, that is Kulturvölker or cultural nations. State nations, he notes, are nations which, for all intents and purposes, are united by sharing a common political history, constitution, or mission. They are artificial and deliberately invented communities which fulfill certain desired purposes of political life and civic duty. Going back to the definitions before, Kumar's definition of a state nation is probably most similar to somewhat the constructivist approach as well as the rational conception of a nation, in that rather than cultural or affective ties, rational deliberations of personal disadvantages and advantages usually prevail. Group belonging in such nations is also more of a rational and active choice. State nations are generally more open and less restrictive than nation states, and are characterized by an active citizenship and civic participation rather than by being part of a certain ethnic or cultural group. Hence, joining such a nation and such a group and belonging to its in-group is comparatively more easy. Kumar concludes that state nations are governed by the so-called law of the soil, which means that it is by inhabiting a certain territory that one receives and incurs the obligation of citizenship. In contrast, nation-states are the more common form of nations and are formed by a shared cultural heritage. And what really binds people together are not the superficial ties of political citizenship, but the deep ties of history, language, literature, and religion. They are, and again here I'm referring back to what I've said before, an amalgamation of various conceptions of a nation, most notably a conception that is conceived of a mythologized historiography, a standardization of language, education, and literature, for instance, and more importantly, one that stresses a common cultural heritage, ethnic core, and thus common cultural ties, which may come, of course, in various forms, from a common history to religion to language to ethnic descent and so on and so forth. Rather than being artificial constructs, nation-states are said to be either of divine origin or simply perceived as naturally or organically formed organisms, which contain the means of growth and development within themselves. As Kumar notes, these nations are governed by the so-called law of blood, as one belongs to it as one would belong to a biological family, for instance. Hence, joining such a nation and becoming a group member of this in-group proves to be very difficult because one needs to be born into this community in order to belong to it. So what is being stressed is less territory and political history, but what is stressed are common blood and common cultural ties. Of course, there are a number of problems with Kumar as with the other definitions. On the one hand, it seems as if state nations are simply rational communities in which political ties always trump cultural ones. However, the case is not quite that simple, as state nations similarly construct and mythologize their pasts, their origin, as well as their political and historical developments. Moreover, the idea of joining either state nations or nation states seems to be comparatively simple in Kumar's words. After all, one can join one nation easily, while you need to be born into the other in order to belong to it. It seems, however, questionable whether these clear-cut separations can still be made. After all, in an increasingly globalized world, joining or moving between different nations has become much, much easier. Additionally, being born into a certain nation-state does not in no way prescribe belonging to the group, as recent debates about what Germanness or German identity is, or the general attitudes leveled towards British-born descendants of, for instance, the Windrush generation has shown. On the other hand, I would argue that Kumar's examples of state nations, and he looks at France and the US, do not encompass recent developments. And while the US as a whole might be a political entity first and foremost, which is similar to the United Kingdom, its individual states and the federal system as a whole has started to shift towards emphasizing not only its political weight, but its cultural weight too. Interestingly enough, both seem to be tied very tightly together, as this excerpt from Biden's first speech as president-elect, for instance, suggests. He says,
"The people of this nation have spoken. They've delivered us a clear victory, a convincing victory. A victory for we the people. I pledge to be a president who doesn't see red states and blue states, only sees the United States. I sought this office to restore the soul of America, to rebuild the backbone of this nation, the middle class. The American story is about slow yet steadily widening the opportunities in America. And make no mistake, too many dreams have been deferred for too long. We must make the promises of the country real for everybody, no matter their race, their ethnicity, their faith, their identity, or their disability. And now together, on eagle's wings, we embark on the work that God and history have called upon us to do. With full hearts and steady hands, with faith in America and in each other, with love of country, a thirst for justice. Let us be the nation that we know we can be. A nation united, a nation strengthened, a nation healed. The United States of America, ladies and gentlemen.
Not only does Biden specifically stress America as one united nation, and not a conglomerate of nations, but he stresses its historiography, one that is specifically suited to his vision of a nation and his outlook on politics. Moreover, he cites not only union, but mythologizes its past, in that he attributes the US to be of some form of divine origin, when he notes that we embark on the work that God and history have called upon us to do. As such, Kumar's idea that there is a clear separation between the conceptions of nationhood seems not really applicable. Nonetheless, Kumar's conceptions of nationhood still serve as a concise way of framing political nationhood and cultural nationhood. And now, these definitions might very well explain what a nation is, but they don't explain what national identity is. To put it very simply, as I've done so in the beginning, national identity is basically a collective identity. And Kevin Robbins states, first, the group has been conceived as a unitary and homogeneous entity, a community of shared substance, and its internal complexity and diversity disavowed. The prevailing images were of a national family, a single body, a shared blood, a common homeland. And second, the group has sought to maintain its culture, its heritage, memories, values, character, particularity and uniqueness throughout time, and to deny the reality of historical change and discontinuity. Positive value was placed on the continuity between generations and on the moral force of tradition. And this, of course, connects national identity very much to how we have framed personal identity, as all of them are based on two principles: continuity throughout time and the perceived homogeneity of the group itself. Furthermore, Robbins proposes another point which may come in handy while taking a closer look at national identity, when he refers to the prevailing image of a national family, which stresses the power a nation has and is able to acquire if it's linked with infantile images and needs intrinsic to most people. As a result, a nation is an abstract construct that is referred to as a family, and which is then able to dominate the affections of its members in a way which the term alone would have never been able to. Thereby, it is to be noted that, apart from being continuous and homogenized, affective ties rather than rational ties help to form national identities. Aside from that, national identity is of course also constructed through processes of inclusion and exclusion, best exemplified by othering. This process portrays the other again as inferior to one's own group. That is often glorified and positively portrayed. And as I've said last week, particular in times of crises, the significant other becomes activated in the national identity of individuals, since the binary construction of us and them helps overcoming the crisis by, for instance, using blaming and scapegoating strategies. National identity generally can be simply regarded as a collective identity on a wider scale, which serves the purpose of providing its members with familiarity, continuity, and coherence within a group in relation to other groups. However, it differentiates itself by the development of a sense of a nation. The development of such a sense is essential for national identity in order to work as an integrative force for its members and can be achieved through a specific set of institutionalized national values and national symbols, which can convey the specifics of the nation to its members. The nation itself, as opposed to, for instance, a group of people that might know one another, can be, as I've said before, and as exemplified by Benedict Anderson, be regarded as an imagined community that is united not only by a common or shared substance, but also by a deep horizontal comradeship. It is first and foremost a social and cultural construct that is in itself free from substance, but a construct that needs and is established by and through symbols, values, and norms. Thus, a nation in which it is no longer possible to know all of its members is based on an imagined principle of communality rather than a real one. It is this feature of a nation that makes the usage of various media and regular symbolic performances of itself necessary in order to remind its members of its specific values, its distinctiveness, and to revoke the effective ties between members and the nation itself. However, simply possessing an array of values, norms, and traditions doesn't really instantly constitute a nation. Rather, nations are, as Ernst Gellner said, more like garden cultures that need to be surveyed, tended to, and codified by specialists. The question that remains after looking at preconceived images which purposely construct a national identity, the symbols used in order to enact identity on a national level, or simply at the scripts that are being provided and the conventions attached to these scripts, is where do these generic images and simplified pictures actually come from? Why do we use certain symbols to enact identity? How is it possible to view England, for instance, as a green and pleasant land, whilst knowing perfectly well that only parts of the country are actually picturesque and green and pleasant? How come that we perceive traditions and national identity as natural and as having derived from an ancient time and passed down throughout the centuries? The answer to those questions is as simple as it is complex. It is simply memory. However, memory in the sense of remembering one's childhood or insignificant details about one's day-to-day business, thus memory of the individual sort, is not the right level of memory to look at. Still, the form of memory which stores away and provides people with this form of perceived knowledge works along very similar lines to individual memory. Cultural memory, thus memory that is connected with a historical time, is shared by a number of people, conveys collective, that is cultural identity, it includes traditions, transmissions, and transferences, and it is cast away in symbols and objects. Furthermore, it depends upon the interaction between people in order to create meaning, but it also incorporates the material contact between a remembering mind and a reminding object, which may remind us, may trigger our memory, because they can carry memories which we have invested into them, things such as dishes, feasts, rites, images, stories, and other texts, landscapes, and other lieux de mémoire. Thereby, cultural memory is a kind of an institution. It is exteriorized, it is objectified, and stored away in symbolic forms that, unlike the sounds of words or the sight of gestures, are stable and situation transcendent. They may be transferred from one situation to another and transmitted from one generation to another. According to Jan Assmann, not only is cultural memory itself an institution, but in order to be re-embodied in the sequence of generations, it also exists in a disembodied form, as it requires institutions of memory, such as museums or libraries, that preserve it in the first place. These institutions in turn serve as a reminder and celebrate their cultural memory by displaying advancements and accomplishments of various fields. Additionally, cultural memory is often supported by institutions of education, transmission, and interpretation in order to teach a specific cultural identity to the members of a society. Apart from being institutionalized, taught, and objectified, cultural memory is concerned with the origins and the myths and early history of a society, and is thus of limitless time depth. In the context of this form of memory, the distinction between history and myth vanishes, as it incorporates the past as it is remembered and not as it truly was. Therefore, history is memory seen through and criticized with the aid of documents of many kinds, whereas memory is a faculty. It is history seen through affect. It is the latter one's connection to emotions that transforms the remembered past into a myth. Myths are, broadly defined, stories of origins that have a comforting function as they offer a secure frame for human experience and moral clarity. They are not necessarily untruth or fiction. They might contain elements of verifiable truth. Their real purpose, however, is not to represent past events with complete accuracy, so much as to tell a story that conveys important ideas about the present and its relationship to the past. These myths, as well as other parts of cultural memory in general, are cultivated by specialists, formalized, stabilized by material symbolization, and on occasion they are openly celebrated according to specific rites and scripts that have been incorporated in cultural memory through repeated performances. As for the time level already mentioned, cultural memory is based on fixed points in the past, reaching as far back as a society can be called ours. The function of history in this context can be linked to the so-called Whig interpretation of history, which seeks to emphasize certain principles of progress in the past and produce a story which is the ratification, if not the glorification, of the present, only by leaving out certain parts, meaning by simply forgetting what lies outside of the relevant. It is only then that memory performs an identity function. Hence, memory can be regarded as knowledge with an identity index. And just like a theatre performance, national identity, as I've said, needs a stage. It needs actors, props, scripts, roles, stage management, choreography, directing, improvisation, and reflexivity in order to be performed properly. As the question of various stages will be explored next week when we talk about Englishness and Britishness, it shall only be mentioned that, as Tim Edensor points out, those stages include and may include various national landscapes, symbolic sites, points of assembly, and landscapes of everyday life, all of which have certain scripts and roles attached to them. Referring to Hobsbawm and Range's work of the invention of tradition, Edensor states that national identity is first and foremost performed through and within invented traditions and rituals, as both are highly specified and disciplinary, and on a national level rehearsed and minutely detailed. Furthermore, such rituals constitute powerful programs for the enaction of collective remembering and systematic forgetting, as these symbols with which we perform identity derive from a common cultural memory. Performing identity, therefore, is a performance of memory, as every time individuals and groups express or embody or interpret or repeat a script about the past, they galvanize the ties that bind groups together and deposit additional memory traces about the past in their own minds. Through the performance and the rehearsal, emotions which gave the initial memory or story embedded in it its sticking power, its resistance or erasure or oblivion, are recharged and evoked constantly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to very briefly go through. That's also a comment on my teaching. Like, It sounded a bit like I'm going to be bleeped out or anything. Nation. What a terrible, terrible curse word. His major differentiation of nations is the difference between state nations and... Fuck it. A standardization of literature. What is this? Interestingly, both seem to be tied very tightly. Why am I doing the Trump hands? Are they very tightly? It's probably because I'm talking about the US. Anyhow, interestingly, blaming and scapegoat. Das kann doch jetzt nicht sein, dass ich schon wieder Scapegoating sage. And scapegoating